All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're going to explore something that sounds pretty basic, but honestly is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Abstraction.
Exactly, abstraction. It's something we use all the time, whether we realize it or not. Like imagine using a map, right?
Okay, yeah.
It's not a perfect representation of the world, obviously. There's way more detail out there than what's on that map, but
But it's still useful. You can still get where you need to go.
exactly. It simplifies things, lets you focus on what's important, and that's what abstraction does for our thinking in general. It helps us make sense of complex stuff. You know, I was looking at the material you sent over, and one quote really jumped out at me. It said that abstraction is like creating a simplified representation of something complex.
Yeah. It's a pretty basic definition, but there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, why is that simplified representation so powerful for us?
Yeah, I was wondering about that too.
Well, it all comes down to our limited brain power, you
Yeah.
know? We simply can't hold all the details of the world in our minds at once.
Makes sense.
Abstraction lets us chunk information together, kind of like zipping a large file. We can deal with the compressed version without getting bogged down by all the bits and bytes.
It's like in design, right? If you're designing a new product, you can't start with like what color it's going to be or what material it's made of. You'll get lost in the weeds before you even know what the product is.
Right. You need abstraction to define the core purpose first. What problem does it solve? Who is it for? What are the essential features?
And then you can get into the specifics. That reminds me of another benefit the source material mentions.
Yeah.
It says that abstraction helps us see the forest for the trees, which I love because it's so true. Like, how often do we get caught up in the details and miss the bigger picture?
All the time. And it's especially important for our listeners, I think. People who are intellectually curious, they want to understand things deeply, but nobody wants to be overwhelmed with information.
Absolutely. And speaking of benefits, the source material actually lists 3 key benefits of abstraction.
Okay.
Simplifying complex info, like we've been talking about. Identifying commonalities and differences between things. And developing general principles. Let's start with that first one, simplifying complex info. I mean, without abstraction, wouldn't we just be constantly drowning in information?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, our brains are wired to recognize patterns and categorize information, but there's a limit, you know? Abstraction is like, it helps us manage that cognitive load.
Right, filter out the noise and all that.
Yeah, focus on what's actually important.
So it's not about dumbing things down or anything. It's about, like, making information
Manageable.
usable. Yeah, like think about trying to understand a scientific paper.
Yep, those can be rough.
Dense, full of jargon. But if you can abstract the key findings, the main takeaways, then you can actually start to engage with the research.
Exactly. And that simplified understanding can be like a launching pad for further exploration, you know? Once you grasp that core idea, you can dive into the details with a much clearer understanding of the overall context.
Yeah. Okay, so we talked about simplification. What about identifying commonalities and differences? I feel like this is so important for critical thinking, right?
Absolutely. This is where abstraction helps us avoid those false equivalencies and superficial comparisons. You know, like two historical events might seem similar at first glance, but when you abstract away from the specific dates and names and stuff, you might find that like the underlying causes or social structures were totally different.
That's such a good point. It's about seeing beyond the surface level, right? Abstraction forces us to dig deeper, find those hidden connections and distinctions.
Exactly. And that leads us to that third benefit, developing general principles.
Yeah.
This is where we take what we've learned from one situation and apply it to others. You know, think about a business lesson, you know, one you might learn from some successful entrepreneur or something.
Right.
By abstracting the core principles of their success, you can then apply those same principles to your own ventures, even if it's in a completely different industry.
This is what I find really exciting. It's about putting knowledge into action, not just acquiring it. Like realizing the world is full of these patterns. And abstraction gives us the tools to recognize and use them.
It's powerful stuff. But it does make you wonder, you know, if abstraction is so useful, are there times when it could be harmful?
Oh, interesting.
Like what happens if we oversimplify? What important nuances might we miss if we focus only on the general and not the specific?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with.
It is, right?
It's a good reminder that abstraction is a tool. And like any tool, it can be misused. So as you revisit that material, think about this. When does abstraction help us? And when might it lead us astray?
Yeah, that's something to ponder.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
Until next time.